Curious. The Desire to Know and Why Your Future Depends on It by Ian Leslie. Introduction. The Fourth Drive. The researchers first realized that Kanzi was an unusually talented ape when they discovered that he had taught himself language. Sue Savage-Rumbaugh and her colleagues at the Language Research Center near Atlanta, Georgia, had devoted months of painstaking effort to teaching Kanzi's adoptive mother, Matata, how to communicate using symbols. They worked with a keyboard that had lexicograms corresponding to things and actions in the real world. There was a key for apple, another one for play. Despite being exceptionally intelligent, Matata made slow progress. She understood that the keyboard could be used to communicate, but the idea that specific symbols had specific significance eluded her. She would take Savage-Rumbaugh's hand and lead her to the keyboard, intent on sharing what was on her mind. Then Matata would press any key and look up expectantly, as if Savage-Rumbaugh would surely know what she meant. She might press juice when what she really wanted was a banana, or groom when she wanted to go outdoors. While the researchers were working with Matata, Kanzi was usually in the room, entertaining himself. It had been a condition of Kanzi's transfer to the Language Center at 6 months old that he be allowed to remain with his mother while she participated in language studies. A hyperactive infant, Kanzi darted around the test room, jumping on his mother's head, pushing her hand away from the keyboard just as she was trying to hit a key, stealing the food she earned as a reward for good work. The researchers had noticed that Kanzi also liked to play with the keyboard when it was free, but they thought little of it. Then one day, when he was 2 years old, Kanzi went up to the keyboard and very deliberately selected the chase key. He looked at Savage-Rumbaugh to see if she had seen what he'd done. When she nodded and smiled, he ran off, looking behind him as he did so, a big, cheeky grin on his face. That day, Kanzi used the keyboard 120 times, making requests for specific foods or games, or announcing what he was about to do. To the astonishment of Savage-Rumbaugh and her colleagues, it became clear that he had mastered the symbolic keyboard, despite having never been trained on it or even seeming to have paid attention to his mother's lessons. Over the following months and years, the researchers turned their full attention to this ape prodigy. Kanzi went on to demonstrate linguistic aptitude of such sophistication that he changed the way cognitive psychologists thought about human learning and language. The difference between an ape and a human being is less than you might think. Kanzi learned a vocabulary of more than 200 words. When he was given tests of reading and communication skills, he matched, and in some respects exceeded, a child of 2.5 years. He made up and follows his own rules of grammar, indicating a creative capacity. He understands spoken language and can follow spoken instructions. When Savage-Rumbaugh told him to throw something into the river, he picked up a rock and hurled it in. He can use symbols to ask for treats or for help opening a door. He loves to play and he loves to learn. The story of Kanzi shows just how much we have in common with apes, which ought not to be a surprise, given that we share nearly all of their DNA. Yet it also suggests there is something that isn't shared, something very important. What Kanzi never did and never does is ask why. He never furrows his brow, leans over the keyboard, and bashes out a sentence like, "Why are you asking me all these questions?" Or, "What exactly are you trying to discover?" He doesn't ask about what lies beyond the confines of his home at the research center. He can go to the refrigerator, but he has no interest in how the refrigerator works. Although he spends time with human beings who are clearly interested in what it is like to be an ape, Kanzi shows no curiosity about what it's like to be a human. For that matter, he shows little curiosity in what it means to be an ape. He has never asked, "Who am I?" "Who am I?" was the question to which John Lloyd awoke on the morning of Christmas Eve 1993. It didn't come to him in the form of a dreamy, philosophical rumination. It was urgent, painful, and insistent. It felt like a drill to the head. Lloyd hadn't lost his memory. He could answer his question in all the ways you would expect. "I'm John Lloyd. I'm 42 years old. I'm 6'1". I'm a successful TV producer and director. I have homes in London and Oxfordshire. I'm married with 3 children." But that morning, none of these answers did anything to salve the pain of the inquiry. The more he thought about it, the more he felt his question pointed not to a loss, but a lack. I realized, he later recalled, that I didn't know anything. Of course, Lloyd did know things. He knew a lot about how to make commercials. He also knew something about how to make TV comedy. During the preceding decade and a half, or, as he described it, 15 insane years, he had gone on an extraordinary, unprecedented hot streak of success, producing some of the most popular and loved comedy shows in Britain, including Not the 9 O'Clock News, Blackadder, and Spitting Image. Lloyd was instrumental in the early successes of some of Britain's most famous actors and comedians, including Rowan Atkinson, Richard Curtis, Stephen Fry, and Hugh Laurie. He had won numerous BAFTAs, Britain's Oscars, for those shows and for his advertising campaigns. In fact, as he admitted with a mixture of pride and sheepishness, "I've won more BAFTAs than anyone except Dame Judi Dench." He was given a Lifetime Achievement Award before he was 40. Shortly afterward, things started going wrong. Lloyd's flawless career hit serious snags. He was fired from advertising campaigns he had created. The head of a Hollywood studio threw his movie script into a swimming pool. Nothing he started got off the ground. He had dealt with disappointments before, but this was different. His failures were as relentless as his previous success had seemed unstoppable. It felt like he was being bullied by a giant bear. Every time I tried to pick myself up, I was smacked down again. That Christmas Eve, Lloyd had been shaken awake by the horrifying thought that everything he had done or achieved thus far was worthless. The BAFTAs on his shelves turned to cardboard. Lloyd entered a serious depression, despite knowing that he had much to be thankful for. Nevertheless, in the years that followed, an intruder to the Lloyd home might have come across the most successful TV producer of his generation sitting under his desk, crying. Lloyd decided to deal with his depression with the same determination with which he had once set about persuading the BBC to recommission a failed sitcom set in medieval England called Blackadder. He eschewed some of the popular strategies for coping with male midlife crises. He didn't go into therapy, buy a sports car, or leave his wife. Instead, he took time off work, went on long walks, and drank whiskey. He also started to read. I didn't read any books during those years of success. I never had time. Despite attending one of Britain's top schools and graduating from Cambridge, Lloyd never considered himself particularly knowledgeable. Now he had the time to catch up. He read about Socrates and ancient Athens. He read about light and magnetism. He read about the Renaissance and the French Impressionists. He had no method or plan, but simply followed his curiosity wherever it took him. On coming across, for the first time, Caillebott's painting of workmen varnishing a Parisian floor, Lloyd grew interested in the history of varnish and found books to read about that. When he started making ads again, he would take a pile of books with him on the plane to far-flung locations and devour their contents. The more he learned, the more he wanted to learn. He was appalled at how little he knew and intimidated by how much there was to catch up on. He was also furious that no one had thought to let him in on a secret. I was suddenly seeing that the world is incredibly interesting. If you're paying attention, everything in the world, from the nature of gravity to a pigeon's head to a blade of grass, is extraordinary. School had been a chore, dull but necessary. This was a pleasure, verging on an obsession. The closer you look at anything, the more interesting it gets. But nobody tells you this. Underpinning his fascination with everything was a driving desire to understand nothing less than the meaning of life. I was really trying to find out, what is the point of me? What is the point of anything? 6 years after he had embarked on his meandering journey through the world's store of knowledge, Lloyd, now over the worst of his depression, was standing in the study of his Oxfordshire home, surrounded by books, when suddenly the top of my head opened and I thought, hang on. Here's an idea, QI. He saw how what had obsessed him for the past few years could be turned into entertainment. It will be a program about interesting things. It will prove that everything is quite interesting if you look at it from the right angle. QI became a BBC quiz show, hosted by Stephen Fry. It is now one of Britain's most popular and long-running TV series, loved by millions for its ability to make anything, from quantum physics to Aztec architecture, entertaining and, well, Interesting. The format is popular abroad, and the book version sells in the hundreds of thousands. Lloyd had finally scored another success, and he was prouder of this one than any of his others. It was the idea of my life. When Lloyd was pitching QI to the BBC, he and his team explained its underlying philosophy to the assembled executives. There is nothing more important or more strange than curiosity, Lloyd told them. Ever since Darwin, he said, we have had to come to terms with the fact that we share with our primate cousins the same three basic drives: food, sex, and shelter. But humans possess something else, a fourth drive. Pure curiosity is unique to human beings. When animals snuffle around in bushes, it's because they're looking for the three other things. It's only people, as far as we know, who look up at the stars and wonder what they are. Our oldest stories about curiosity are warnings. Adam and Eve and the apple of knowledge, Icarus and the sun, Pandora's box. Early Christian theologians railed against curiosity. St. Augustine claimed that God fashioned hell for the inquisitive. Even humanist philosopher Erasmus suggested that curiosity was greed by a different name. For most of Western history, it has been regarded as at best a distraction, at worst a poison, corrosive to the soul and to society. There's a reason for this. Curiosity is unruly. It doesn't like rules, or at least it assumes that all rules are provisional, subject to the laceration of a smart question nobody has yet thought to ask. It disdains the approved pathways, preferring diversions, unplanned excursions, impulsive left turns. In short, curiosity is deviant. Pursuing it is liable to bring you into conflict with authority at some point, as everyone from Galileo to Charles Darwin to Steve Jobs could have attested. A society that values order above all else will seek to suppress curiosity. But a society that believes in progress, innovation, and creativity will cultivate it, recognizing that the inquiring minds of its people constitute its most valuable asset. In medieval Europe, the inquiring mind, especially if it inquired too closely into the edicts of church or state, was stigmatized. During the Renaissance and Reformation, received wisdoms began to be interrogated, and by the time of the Enlightenment, European society started to see that their future lay with the curious and encouraged probing questions rather than stamping on them. The result was the biggest explosion of new ideas and scientific advances in history. The great unlocking of curiosity translated into a cascade of prosperity for the nations that precipitated it. Today, we cannot know for sure if we are in the middle of this golden period or at the end of it. But we are, at the very least, in a lull. With the important exception of the internet. The innovations that catapulted Western societies ahead of the global pack are thin on the ground, while the rapid growth of Asian and South American economies has not yet been accompanied by a comparable run of indigenous innovation. Tyler Cowen, a professor of economics at George Mason University in Virginia, has termed the current period the Great Stagnation. Cowen says that the rich world is struggling to cope with the consequences of its own success. It now finds it much harder to raise the educational levels of its populaces, rather than just getting more people to school and university. Therefore, the new challenge is to find ways of making more people hungry to learn, question, and create. Meanwhile, the leaders of Asian societies, such as those of China and Singapore, are wondering how to instill a culture of inquiry and critical thinking into their educational systems, aware that people who defer too much to the authority of their elders' ideas are less likely to transcend them. The world is in need of more curious learners. Edmund Phelps, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, believes that the grassroots spirit of enterprise that fueled the Industrial Revolution is being suffocated by the dead weight of state and corporate bureaucracy. During a roundtable discussion of Phelps's work, a senior executive at the international bank BNY Mellon told Phelps, "So much of what you've talked about is what we struggle with daily as a large global financial corporation. As our regulators and societies want us to be more controlled, we want to create a culture that is more collaborative, is more creative, and more competitive. We need our staff to be active, inquiring, imaginative, and full of ideas and curiosity in order to create innovation. The truly curious will be increasingly in demand. Employers are looking for people who can do more than follow procedures competently or respond to requests, who have a strong, intrinsic desire to learn, solve problems, and ask penetrating questions. They may be difficult to manage at times. These individuals, for their interests and enthusiasms, can take them along unpredictable paths, and they don't respond well to being told what to think. But for the most part, they will be worth the difficulty. Curious learners go deep, and they go wide. They are the people best equipped for the kind of knowledge-rich, cognitively challenging work required in industries such as finance or software engineering. They are also the ones most likely to make creative connections between different fields, of the kind that lead to new ideas, and the ones best suited to working in multidisciplinary teams. Consequently, they are the ones whose jobs are least likely to be taken by intelligent machines. In a world where technology is rapidly replacing humans, even in white-collar jobs, it's no longer enough to be merely smart. Computers are smart, but no computer, however sophisticated, can yet be said to be curious. Another way of putting this is that there is a rising premium on people with a high need for cognition. Need for cognition, or NFC, is a scientific measure of intellectual curiosity. The drive to make sense of the world is a universal characteristic of human beings, but the world is divided into those who always seek out shortcuts and those who prefer to take the scenic route. Psychologists use a scale of NFC to distinguish between individuals who like their mental life to be as straightforward as possible and those who derive satisfaction and pleasure from intellectual challenges. I'm going to assume that if you're reading this book, you have a reasonably high NFC. But here is a simple way to assess yourself, based on a questionnaire invented by the psychologists who first formulated the concept. Answer each question true or false, choosing the answer that most often applies to you. 1. I would prefer complex to simple problems. 2. I like to have the responsibility of handling a situation that requires a lot of thinking. 3. Thinking is not my idea of fun. 4. I would rather do something that requires little thought than something that is sure to challenge my thinking abilities. 5. I try to anticipate and avoid situations where there is a likely chance I will have to think in depth about something. 6. I find satisfaction in deliberating hard and for long hours. 7. I only think as hard as I have to. 8. I prefer to think about small, daily projects than long-term ones. 9. I like tasks that require little thought once I've learned them. 10. The idea of relying on thought to make my way to the top appeals to me. 11. I really enjoy a task that involves coming up with new solutions to problems. 12. Learning new ways to think doesn't excite me very much. 13. I prefer my life to be filled with puzzles that I can't solve. 14. The notion of thinking abstractly is appealing to me. 15. I would prefer a task that is intellectual, difficult, and important to one that is somewhat important but does not require much thought. 16. I feel relief rather than satisfaction after completing a task that required a lot of mental effort. 17. It's enough for me that something gets the job done. I don't care how or why it works. 18. I usually end up deliberating about issues, even when they do not affect me personally. If you answered true to most of the questions 1, 2, 6, 10, 11, 13, 14, 15, and 18 and false to most of the others, then the chances are you are higher in NFC than the average person. People who are low in NFC are more likely to rely on others to explain things, or to fall back on cognitive heuristics, like agreeing with what everyone else seems to be saying. If you are high in NFC, you are more likely to actively seek out experiences and information that make you think, challenge your assumptions, and pose puzzles. You have a restless, inquiring mind, and you are constantly on the lookout for new intellectual journeys. Low NFC people are cognitive misers who seek to expend as little mental effort as they can get away with. Whereas high NFC people positively enjoy effortful cognitive activity, they are the ones who read nonfiction books like this one, or tingle with anticipation at the prospect of learning about a new idea. That word, effortful, is important A major concern of this book is that digital technologies are severing the link between effort and mental exploration. By making it easier for us to find answers, the web threatens habits of deeper inquiry, habits that require patience and focused application. When you're confident that you can find out anything you want on your smartphone, you may be less likely to make the effort to learn the kind of knowledge that might lead you to query the answer that comes at the top of a Google search. As we'll see, there are those who argue that by releasing us from the need to use our memories, the internet is allowing us to be more creative. But such claims fly in the face of everything scientists have learned about how the mind works. Effort and pleasure can go together, of course. If you are high in NFC, you are probably good at solving problems for your employer because you're really solving them for yourself. Social scientists who study group behavior have observed a phenomenon they call social loafing, the widespread tendency of individuals to decrease their own effort when they start working collaboratively. When confident that others are working on the same problem, most people cut themselves some slack. But individuals who are high in need for cognition seem to form an exception to this rule. When given a cognitively challenging task to do in a group, they generate just as many different ideas as when working alone. They're having fun. If you scored high on the test, congratulations. Don't let it go to your head, though. Just because you have a high NFC now doesn't mean you'll always have one, as John Lloyd can tell you. It's true that some people are more disposed to be cognitively demanding of themselves than others. But the scientific literature on curiosity, while it disagrees on many things, agrees on this. A person's curiosity is more state than trait. That is, our curiosity is highly responsive to the situation or environment we're in. It follows that we can arrange our lives to stoke our curiosity or quash it. Curiosity is vulnerable to benign neglect. As we grow older, we tend to become less active explorers of our mental environment, relying on what we've learned so far to see us through the rest of the journey. We can also become too preoccupied with the daily skirmishes of existence to take the time to pursue our interests. If you allow yourself to become incurious, your life will be drained of color, interest, and pleasure. You will be less likely to achieve your potential at work or in your creative life. While barely noticing it, you'll become a little duller, a little dimmer. You may not think it could happen to you, but it can. It can happen to any of us. To stop it from happening, you need to understand what feeds curiosity and what starves it. That's what this book is about. Sometime in the early 1480s, Leonardo da Vinci made a doodle in his notebook. He seems to have bought a new pen and was trying it out, absent-mindedly. What he wrote was a wandering riff on the phrase "dimmy." Tell me whether. Tell me how things are. Curiosity starts with the itch to explore. From a very early age, we display a yearning to conquer the unknown. A 1964 study found that babies as young as 2 months old, when presented with different patterns, will show a marked preference for the unfamiliar ones. Every parent knows about the child's compulsion to stick tiny fingers where they are not supposed to go, to run out of the open door, to eat dirt. This attraction to everything novel is what the scientists who study it call diversive curiosity. In adults, diversive curiosity manifests itself as a restless desire for the new and the next. The modern world seems designed to stimulate our diversive curiosity. Every tweet, headline, ad, blog post, and app at once promises and denies the satisfaction for which we are ever more impatient. Our popular entertainments are expertly crafted to hook our attention and keep it by moving fast. The average shot in an American movie today is about 2 seconds, compared with 27.9 seconds in 1953. Diversive curiosity is essential to an exploring mind. It opens our eyes to the new and undiscovered, encouraging us to seek out new experiences and meet new people. But unless it's allowed to deepen and mature, it can become a futile waste of energy and time, dragging us from one object of attention to another without reaping insight from any. Unfettered curiosity is wonderful. Unchanneled curiosity is not. When diversive curiosity is entrained, when it is transformed into a quest for knowledge and understanding, it nourishes us. This deeper, more disciplined, and effortful type of curiosity is called epistemic curiosity, and it is the chief subject of this book. For individuals, epistemic curiosity can be a font of satisfaction and delight that provides sustenance for the soul. For organizations and nations, it can supercharge creative talent and ignite innovation, turning the base metal of diversive curiosity into gold. To get a probe to Mars, you need a powerful desire to explore a distant planet, but you will need to combine this with an enduring appetite for problem solving if you are to figure out how to get a camera up there. Diversive curiosity has always been with us, and so has epistemic curiosity. But the latter has flourished on a widespread scale only in the modern era. Since the invention of the printing press allowed people to read, share, and combine ideas from all over the world, and since the Industrial Revolution created more time for more people to think and experiment, the internet ought to be giving epistemic curiosity another epical boost, because it is making knowledge more widely available than ever before. But its amazing potential is undermined by our tendency to use it merely to stimulate diversive curiosity. A secondary subject of this book is empathic curiosity. Curiosity about the thoughts and feelings of other people. Empathic curiosity is distinct from gossip or prurience, which we can think of as diversive curiosity about the superficial detail of others' lives. You practice empathic curiosity when you genuinely try to put yourself in the shoes and the mind of the person you're talking to see things from their perspective. Diversive curiosity might make you wonder what a person does for a living. Empathic curiosity makes you wonder why they do it. I'll be arguing that empathic curiosity became a common cognitive habit at around the same point in history as epistemic curiosity. It is no coincidence that the two are tied to each other. Curiosity is a deeply social quality. Almost from the beginning of life, we wonder what it is that other people know that we don't. A baby's way of saying, "Tell me," is to point to an object while looking at her mother. Whether our curiosity grows or shrinks is also dependent on others. If the baby's mother answers his wordless question, he'll point to something else. If she ignores his gesture, he'll stop pointing. It's a dynamic that works its way through our lives, from home to school to the office. Curiosity is contagious. So is incuriosity. Our attitudes to curiosity retain the taint of ancient. Warnings. We call people curious when we mean weird. We associate intellectual curiosity with dusty academics immersed in esoterica or with the lone, eccentric tinkering in his study, rather than with innovation, collaboration, or entrepreneurialism. Curiosity is regarded by companies and governments as, at worst, a threat to established orders and, at best, a wasteful luxury. As a result, we fail to invest in it. Our educational system is increasingly focused on preparing students for specific jobs. To teach someone to be an engineer or a lawyer or a programmer is not the same as teaching them to be a curious learner. Yet the people who make the best engineers, lawyers, and programmers tend to be the most curious learners. So we find ourselves stuck in a self-defeating cycle. We ask schools to focus on preparing students for the world of work rather than on inspiring them, and we end up with uninspired students and mediocre professionals. The more we chase the goal of efficient education, the further it recedes. The rewards of curiosity have never been higher, but our ideas about how curiosity works are muddled and misguided. We romanticize the natural curiosity of children and worry that it will be contaminated by knowledge when the opposite is true. We confuse the practice of curiosity with ease of access to information and forget that real curiosity requires the exercise of effort. We focus on the goals of learning rather than valuing learning for itself. Epistemic curiosity is in danger of becoming the province of cognitive elites, with far too many of us losing or never learning the capacity to think deeply about a subject or a person. In a world where vast inequalities in access to information are finally being leveled, a new divide is emerging between the curious and the incurious. The only reason people do not know much is because they do not care much. They are incurious. Incuriosity is the oddest and most foolish failing there is. Stephen Fry. The most fundamental reason TO choose curiosity isn't so that we can do better at school or at work. The true beauty of learning stuff, including apparently useless stuff, is that it takes us out of ourselves, reminds us that we are part of a far greater project, one that has been underway for at least as long as human beings have been talking to each other. Other animals don't share or store their knowledge like we do. Orangutans do not reflect on the history of the orangutan. London's pigeons have not adopted ideas on navigation from pigeons in Rio de Janeiro. We should all feel privileged to have access to a deep well of species memory. As comedian Stephen Fry suggests, it's foolish not to take advantage of it. Yet that's how many people live. I went to a school where few students read books unless they had to. Most of my school friends left school at the earliest legal opportunity. College was a soft option, a way of deferring adulthood. Being a man meant getting a job, putting learning behind you. I never felt like that, in large part because my parents, neither of whom attended college, infected me with their curiosity about the world. They had hungry minds, and the shelves at home were full of books, bought not for the purpose of decoration, but for enjoyment and edification. Conversations around the dinner table were as likely to be about history, music, or politics as what we'd done that day. Being epistemically curious seemed like a natural way of life. As I grew older, I came to think of it as a crucial condition of feeling fulfilled and alive. Science supports this intuition. Neurologists use the term cognitive reserve to describe the brain's capacity to resist the ravages of old age. For a study published in 2013, a team led by Robert Wilson at the Rush University Medical Center in Chicago enrolled 300 elderly people and tested their thinking and memory skills each year. The participants were also asked about how often they read, wrote, and engaged in other cognitively demanding activities, not just currently, but in childhood and middle age. Following each participant's death, their brain was examined for evidence of dementia. It was discovered that, after taking into account the physical effects of dementia on their brains, the subjects who made a lifelong habit of a lot of reading and writing slowed their rate of mental decline by a third, compared to those who did only an average amount of those things. In other words, these people had cheated old age. Years spent in intellectual pursuits meant they had accrued extra neuronal capacity, buffering them against the debilitating effects of age. A lifelong investment in their cognitive reserve was paying back. We are part biological organism, part cultural. We need both sunlight and knowledge to thrive. While I was writing this book, I became a father for the first time to a little girl. As I watch her hungry eyes attempt to penetrate the mysterious world in which she finds herself, the studiousness with which she examines her own toes, I can feel the urgent pulse of her desire to know. I hope it never fades. I hate to think it will. After researching this book, I realize that's up to me as well as her. John Lloyd recalled how he came to see that during the years of his greatest successes, he wasn't fully human. If human curiosity isn't fed, then you die inside a quarter of your desire to be alive is cut away. At least that, I'd say. Beyond the age of information, said designer Charles Eames, is the age of choices. Isn't it time to reassess your relationship with what Aristotle called the desire to know, to choose curiosity? Curiosity is often discussed in relation to scientific discovery. Science and scientists certainly play major roles in this book. But I'll be placing curiosity in a wider context, one that accommodates curiosity about the structure of a Beethoven symphony or the life of Martin Luther King. Epistemic curiosity in these pages refers to a wide-ranging desire for intellectual and cultural exploration. People who rarely read or wrote experienced a decline that was a staggering 48% faster compared to the average participants. Part 1. How Curiosity Works. Chapter 1. 3 Journeys. In the 1960s, Brian Smith was growing up in an apartment over a shoe store in a poor but lively neighborhood of St. Louis, Missouri. The part of town in which his family lived was crowded and busy, full of cars, restaurants, bars, and nightclubs. In the evenings, the red light of a neon sign for red goose shoes shone through the window into their living room. One evening, when he was about 10 years old, Brian and his younger brother Paul were playing in their parents' bedroom. They started rummaging through the dresser drawers. While doing so, they came across a large, solid object tucked under their father's underwear. Lifting up the clothes, they discovered what it was: a gun. The brothers were transfixed. They let themselves touch its cold, metallic surface, feeling little shock waves of excitement travel up their arms. Brian picked up the gun. It was unexpectedly heavy. Holding the weapon's muzzle toward his face, he could see that its cylinder was loaded with bullets. The brothers were fans of TV programs such as The Lone Ranger and The Cisco Kid, and in their parents' bedroom that day they staged pretend gunfights. One brother would take turns pointing the weapon at the other, who would then take the shot, falling dramatically to the ground. Afterwards, they put the gun back in the drawer, being careful to replace it under the clothes, exactly as it had been found. For weeks after that, the gun in the drawer was the boys' secret, one they vowed not to share with anyone else. Then one evening, Brian and his siblings found themselves alone in the apartment for a short period. Brian was watching TV in his parents' bedroom. It was a warm evening and the window was open. Though he tried not to, Brian kept thinking about the gun just a few feet away. In the end, he recalls, "My curiosity got the better of me." Brian went to the dresser, retrieved the gun from the drawer, and walked over to the open window. Pretending to be an assassin, he pointed the weapon at the people walking along the sidewalk opposite the apartment on their way to a bar or restaurant for the evening. He imagined pulling the trigger and simulated a recoil gesture, like the ones he had seen people make on TV when they fired a shot. He dared to cock back the hammer of the gun, thrilling to the sound of its click. He took aim at the red goose sign, resting his finger lightly on the trigger. Boom! The red neon goose suddenly went dark. Disoriented, Brian saw smoke coming from the muzzle of the revolver. He looked out the window. Down on the sidewalk, pedestrians were scrambling for cover and trying to work out where the shot had come from. Brian ducked out of sight. He replaced the gun in his parents' dresser drawer and sat back down in front of the TV, his heart racing. What the hell just happened? He was terrified that he had shot someone. His brother came into the room. "What was that big bang?" "I don't know," said Brian, eyes on the TV, heart hammering. When his brother had gone, he took a surreptitious glance out the window. He couldn't see any bodies in the street. His mother came home complaining about some idiot having fired a gun outside, but she didn't mention any casualties. No ambulance sirens sounded. The cars and pedestrians resumed their flow. Brian's heart gradually resumed its normal rate. Brian and his brother were lucky, as were the pedestrians who nearly got in the way of the bullet Brian fired that day. In 2013, a 9-year-old boy in Decatur, Ohio, was playing with a loaded handgun he had found in his parents' bedroom when it discharged, killing him. According to pediatrician Vincent Iannelli, there were 122 unintentional firearm deaths of children in America in 2007 and an additional 3,060 non-fatal shooting accidents, and the numbers have remained about the same since. Most of these children would have been repeatedly warned, at school and at home, that guns are dangerous, but still could not resist picking one up. Self-preservation is our most deep-rooted instinct, but curiosity is powerful enough to override it. The day they picked up the gun, Brian and his brother had been seized by diversive curiosity, the desire for novelty. Children vibrate with diversive curiosity. It powers their unceasing explorations. It's the desire to see what happens when I put my hand in this flame, or dirt in my mouth, or a gun in my hand. In our adult lives, it generates a restless desire for new information and new experiences. Just as it made us peer into rock pools as children, as adults it makes us refresh Twitter streams. Diversive curiosity follows no particular process or method, but slides from one novel object of attention to the next. Boredom is furiously averted or deferred. New information and sensations are constantly sought. It is impulsive and irresistible. It seizes us. In a variation on the famous marshmallow test, in which a child is presented with a treat and asked if he can resist eating it for 5 minutes. Experimenters asked children not to turn around to look at an attractive toy behind them and observe whether they can resist the temptation. Few can. It's not just children. St. Augustine told the story of Alypius from Rome, who detested and was utterly opposed to gladiatorial shows. On the day of one of these shows, he bumped into some friends who virtually dragged him along to the amphitheater. Stubbornly, Alypius closed his eyes as the show began. But when the crowd roared, he was overcome by curiosity and took a peek. He was, recounts St. Augustine, scarred for life. Diversive curiosity can be a strength, leading people to take in more from their environment. But it can quickly become aimless, distracting, and frustrating. In a 1993 study, researchers interviewed 30 people about their mail delivery and found that although people looked forward to their daily post with anticipation and impatience, most reported almost always being disappointed by the actual mail they received. In the era of email and social media, this compulsive cycle of anticipation and disappointment is repeated dozens, if not hundreds of times a day. Though he calls it simply curiosity, 18th century thinker Edmund Burke captures the nature of diversive curiosity perfectly. The first and the simplest emotion which we discover in the human mind is curiosity. By curiosity, I mean whatever desire we have for, or whatever pleasure we take in, novelty. We see children perpetually running from place to place to hunt out something new. They catch with great eagerness and with very little choice at whatever comes before them. Their attention is engaged by everything because everything has, in that stage of life, the charm of novelty to recommend it. But as those things which engage us merely by their novelty cannot attach us for any length of time, curiosity is the most superficial of all the affections. It changes its object perpetually. It has an appetite which is very sharp, but very easily satisfied, and it has always an appearance of giddiness, restlessness, and anxiety. It's odd to hear Burke rail against curiosity like this, because he himself was what we might think of as a deeply curious man, interested in everything from the meaning of beauty to the living conditions of Britain's colonial subjects. But as we shall see, curiosity's connection to learning took hold relatively recently. In fact, it started around the time that Burke was writing. Diversive curiosity is where the hunt for knowledge begins, in the desire for new information, sensations, experiences, and challenges. But it's only a beginning. If there's something oddly familiar about Burke's description, that's probably because it might be used to describe the way we often use the internet. Clicking from link to link, searching for the new thing without ever stopping long enough to learn or absorb what's in front of us. In our digital world, diversive curiosity is constantly stimulated by ever-present streams of texts, emails, tweets, reminders, and news alerts that stimulate our hunger for novelty. In the process, our capacity for the slow, difficult, and frustrating process of gathering knowledge may be deteriorating. When he was 38, Alexander Argels concluded, regretfully, that he knew too many languages. It was 2001, and he had just returned to South Korea after a month's stay in St. Petersburg, where he had taken one-on-one lessons in Russian with a private tutor for 6 hours a day. By the time he left St. Petersburg, he felt able to hold his own with natives of the Russian tongue. But when he got back to his small house in the Korean countryside and sat down to read Turgenev and Dostoevsky in the original, he found himself in over his head. His grasp of the Russian vocabulary was insufficient to appreciate the greatest works of that language. He confronted a painful choice. Ever since he was a boy, Argels has been endlessly hungry for languages to learn. Born and raised in New York, as a child he traveled widely with his family across India, North Africa, and Europe, staying for a while in Italy. His father was a self-taught polyglot, and Argels grew up observing him switch effortlessly from language to language, depending on to whom he was talking. His father, whom he remembers as an intimidating figure, didn't encourage him to take his lead. But Alexander had been bitten by the linguistic bug. Learning languages certainly didn't come naturally to him. He made slow progress with French at school and nearly gave it up. But he persisted and eventually found that he enjoyed the challenge of new languages. When he was 14, he started reading German writers and philosophers in translation, such as Goethe and Immanuel Kant. He knew he would have to learn German to a high standard if he was to read them in their native tongue and so really understand, at the deepest level, their ideas. In college, more languages gave up their mysteries to him: French, Latin, ancient Greek, and Sanskrit. Argels became fascinated by the idea of having an encyclopedic mind, one that gave him a panoptic view of the world's accumulated wisdom. He set his heart on learning as many languages as he could. After graduating, he went on to study the history of religion at the University of Chicago, where he signed up for classes in Persian and Old French, though they weren't relevant to his doctorate. One day, Argels was summoned to the office of his advisor, who asked him why he was attending Persian classes instead of devoting his time to the study of religion. Argels answered candidly, he just loved learning languages. His advisor shook his head. "You will not be taken seriously as a scholar," he said, with that attitude. "You have to choose." Argels was forced to drop Persian, but got away with continuing to study Old French, Old German, Old English, and Norse. After Chicago, he moved to Berlin, where he held a postdoctoral fellowship in German philology. His passion for language again held sway, consuming more energy than his official course of study. Argels was determined to become as fluent in German as a native speaker. He abolished English from his speech and even from his thoughts. He asked acquaintances to correct every mistake he made, looked up every new expression he encountered, and met a professional phonetician every week to perfect his accent. After a while, he stopped worrying about how to speak German and simply began to live in it. His fellowship enabled him to travel widely across Europe, and he used the opportunity to learn yet more languages. He discovered that languages that seemed quite different on the surface shared hidden similarities. Each new language became a variation on a theme, rather than a new entity to be learned from scratch. The languages in his head began speaking to each other. Swedish revealed itself to be a combination of languages he already knew: Norse, Old German, and English. After 3 weeks of study, he was able to hold his own in complex conversations with native Swedes. Not that it ever became easy. There is no secret, he says, except hours of concentration. Argels didn't only have to study hard to learn more languages, he also had to develop a new personality. A naturally reticent man, he forced himself to become garrulous, seeking out conversations he would otherwise have avoided, with natives of whichever language he was learning. Argels still craved a real linguistic challenge. He decided to attempt mastery of Asian languages and took up a post at a university in South Korea. The campus was on an isolated hill amid pine and bamboo forests and rice fields, and Argels's room had a view of the Pacific Ocean. For the next 5 years, he settled into an almost monastic routine, going to sleep at 8 and rising at 2, studying for 16 hours each day. He learned Korean, Mandarin, Japanese, and Malay-Indonesian. He explored the Celtic and Slavic families, made forays into Finnish, Zulu, Swahili, ancient Egyptian, and Quechua, and became at home in Arabic and Persian. It was only after his trip to Russia that Argels realized he would have to abandon many of the languages he had begun to learn in order to go deeper into the ones he already knew. The stories of Brian Smith and Alexander Argels appear to have little in common, but they are both examples, albeit unusual ones, of the same thing: the deepening of a simple urge to explore into an enduring desire to learn. There are two sides of curiosity. One compels us to turn over stones, open cupboards, and click on links, the kind that can make the high-minded Professor Pry open the pages of the glossy magazine in front of her and the teenager slip a cigarette out of his mother's pack. The other makes us want to spend time finishing long novels and pursuing interests that have nothing to do with our self-interest, like learning dead languages. What distinguishes one from the other is the accumulation of specialized knowledge. Brian Smith never mentioned what happened with the gun that night to any of his siblings. He escaped any repercussions, including what he knew would have been a fearsome punishment from his mother. But the incident left its mark on him in another way. He turned his dangerous curiosity about guns into an enduring desire to learn about them. and became educated about them in a way that went far beyond the cursory explanation of their dangers offered to most kids at school. As an adult, Smith became a police officer in Chicago and gained expertise in the use of firearms. Over the years, he trained thousands of law enforcement officers in their operation, including a team deployed to protect Hillary Clinton when she was First Lady. Now that he is retired from the force, Smith looks back on that evening and reflects on the dangers of untutored curiosity. Alexander Argel started out wanting to learn languages because being multilingual seemed like an exciting prospect. He soon found that the more he learned, the more he could explore. As he grew older, his curiosity deepened into a desire to absorb the wisdom of the world's finest minds. Without a knowledge of guns, Brian Smith's desire to explore them was dangerous. Then again, without a desire to explore, he might not have accumulated the expertise that he did. Epistemic curiosity represents the deepening of a simple seeking of newness into a directed attempt to build understanding. It's what happens when diversive curiosity grows up. Epistemic curiosity is hard work. It involves sustained cognitive effort. That makes it tougher, but ultimately more rewarding. Just as the resistance offered by a tungsten filament to electrons generates light in a light bulb, it's the very difficulty of exercising epistemic curiosity that brings illumination. In its raw, impulsive form, curiosity deserves its reputation for danger, as Brian Smith will attest. The explorations that toddlers make can lead them into trouble. That's why adults put gates at the top of the stairs. High diversive curiosity is counted as a risk factor for drug addiction and arson. Experts say that one of the reasons children start fires is that they are overwhelmed by curiosity to see what something looks like when it is set alight. There's absolutely no financial gain to knowing languages, Argels told an interviewer recently. It's a waste of time and energy. Why do we take risks to achieve knowledge that has no immediate use or benefit? Economists find this hard to explain because it doesn't fit their models of human behavior. It's also hard to understand from an evolutionary standpoint. If our primary goal is to survive long enough to pass on our genes, why are we born with this apparent need to put our well-being at risk? Or at least to create difficulty and uncertainty where before there were none? Why is Homo sapiens such a curious animal? Imagine a human hunter, armed only with a rudimentary stone weapon such as a slingshot, looking for an animal to kill and eat. First, he has to find it, and then he has to get relatively close to it because his weapon has a short range. Then he has to kill it before getting killed himself. It is a complex problem. Solving it requires knowledge. The hunter has to know how to read animal tracks so that he can work out which animal has left them, in which direction it is moving, and, judging by their freshness, how far away it might be. He may also be able to glean clues as to the age of the animal, its sex, size, and physical condition. Then, when he is closing in on it, he has to deploy his knowledge of animal behavior to predict its next move. For instance, whether snorting or salivating indicates that it is about to attack or take flight, and, in either case, how fast the animal is likely to move. It's unlikely that this will be a solo mission. He'll probably be hunting in a group. But that makes things only more complex. Now he has to know what the role of each member of the group is, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and who he can and cannot trust. Knowing stuff was always important to the survival of humans and their forebears, particularly because they were physically weaker than some of their adversaries. At some point in their evolution, humans evolved capacious memories, which meant they could afford to make speculative investments in knowledge. Rather than simply seeking out the information they needed at the time they needed it, when they were hungry, for instance, they could gather and store information for use at a later date. One exploratory expedition could yield information that might be used many times over during their lifetimes, or never at all. Stephen Kaplan, an evolutionary psychologist at the University of Michigan, describes the early human as a far-ranging and yet home-based animal. The more information about her environment a human acquired, the more likely she would be to survive and pass on her genes. Gathering that knowledge meant venturing out into the unknown to spot new sources of water or edible plants. But doing so meant risking one's survival. you might become vulnerable to predators or get lost. The individuals more likely to survive would have been those adept at striking a balance between knowledge gathering and self-preservation. Perhaps as an incentive to take a few risks in the pursuit of new information, evolution tied the act of curiosity to pleasure. Most of us know what Copernicus meant when he described the unbelievable pleasure of the spirit he found in learning. Neuroscientists have located this pleasure in one of the brain's chemical messengers. Scientists at the California Institute of Technology asked undergraduates 40 trivia questions while in a brain scanner. After reading each question, the subjects were told to silently guess the answer and to indicate their curiosity about the correct answer. Then they saw the question presented again, followed by the answer. The questions that stoked their curiosity were stimulating their caudate nucleus, a part of the brain associated with both learning and romantic love. The caudate nucleus is closely packed with neurons that traffic in dopamine, a chemical that surges through our brains when we enjoy sex or food. As the brain has evolved, it seems to have bootstrapped the urge for intellectual investigation onto the same pathway as our most primal pleasures. The caudate nucleus has also been implicated in our responses to visual beauty, and there may be a deep connection between our aesthetic predilections and our hunger for knowledge. Numerous studies have shown that when people from different cultures are presented with pictures of landscapes, they prefer those that show scenes from nature, and in particular those that feature water sources, rivers, oceans, waterfalls. That suggests we are unconsciously assessing how we might get along where we dropped into the environment we're looking at. But what's really interesting is that the most consistent and universal predictor of preference in these studies is mystery. Scenes that hint at something the viewer cannot see, a winding path leading off into the distance, or dense foliage with a hint of a gap through which one could pass. The reassuring presence of something we know is good for us gives us pleasure. But so does the promise of what lies beyond, the information we don't yet know. About 60,000 years ago, a small population of humans journeyed out of Africa and struck out for the unknown. They left their primate cousins behind, along with the ecological niche they had shared with them. Nearly all animals are confined to their niches. Gorillas do not seek to leave the jungle and make a home in the river. Mackerel aren't foolhardy enough to see if they can make it on the land. Tree frogs stick close to trees. But when humans left the savannah, they took up residency on coasts, in deserts and forests, on mountains, plains, and ice caps, even in outer space. In all these places, they built specially designed shelters and invented new ways of getting around. They made themselves at home. What makes us so adaptable? In one word, culture, our ability to learn from others, to copy, imitate, share, and improve. When humans learned to communicate using oral and later written language, ideas, knowledge, and practices, how to make a fish hook, build a boat, fashion a spear, sing a song, or carve a god, could replicate and combine like genes. But unlike genes, they could jump from one mind to another across distances of time and space. Culture freed humans from the limitations of their biology. According to evolutionary biologist Mark Pagel, when humans discovered culture, they achieved a momentous shift in the balance of power between our genes and our minds. Humans became the only species to acquire guidance on how to live from the accumulated knowledge of their ancestors, rather than just from their DNA. Humans can learn from peers and from parents and elders. We can also learn from our ancestors. This ability to pass on knowledge, not only to each other, but down generations, is what makes us so adaptive, inventive, and imaginative. Knowledge builds on knowledge, ideas on ideas. That we no longer have to invent the wheel enables us to invent the automobile. As Pagel puts it, having culture is why we watch 3D TV and build cathedrals while our close genetic relatives, chimps, sit in the forest as they have for millions of years cracking the same nuts and stones. A cultural animal must be a curious animal. Evolution has selected for the ability to absorb culture as surely as it selected for our instinct to run away from angry bears. As developmental psychologist Alison Gopnik says, for human beings, nurture is our nature. Epistemic curiosity, a desire for cultural information, was one of the traits that enabled humans not just to journey out of Africa, but to put down roots in every corner of the world. Diversive curiosity makes us want to know what lies on the other side of the mountain. Epistemic curiosity arms us with the knowledge we need to survive when we get there. Every human society is, in Mark Pagel's words, a cultural survival vehicle, rich in accumulated knowledge. Every baby is born with a powerful urge to explore it. Once they have acquired what they need to know in order to get by, some adults cease striving to learn from those around them. Others continue to explore with the ardor of a child. A page from Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks is a to-do list. Here is an edited version in translation. Calculate the measurement of Milan and its suburbs. Find a book that treats of Milan its churches, which is to be had at the stationers on the way to Corduccio. Discover the measurement of the Corte Vecchio. Get the master of arithmetic to show you how to square a triangle. Ask Benedetto Portinari by what means they go on ice at Flanders. Draw Milan. Ask Maestro Antonio how mortars are positioned on bastions by day or night. Examine the crossbow of Maestro Ginetto. Find a master of hydraulics and get him to tell you how to repair a lock, canal, and mill in the Lombard manner. Ask about the measurement of the sun. Promise Me by Maestro Giovanni Francesi. Perhaps the first thing that you notice about this list is the dazzling diversity of Leonardo's interests. He is eager to learn about everything, from the distance of the sun from the earth to the workings of a crossbow and ice skating in Flanders. Life would be more straightforward if we knew what we needed to find out, if we were told at birth exactly what we need to know to be happy. But in a complex world, it's impossible to know what might be useful in the future. It's important, therefore, to spread our cognitive bets. Curious people take risks, try things out, allow themselves to become productively distracted. They know that something they learn by chance today may well come in useful tomorrow, or spark a new way of thinking about an entirely different problem. The more unpredictable the environment, the more important a seemingly unnecessary breadth and depth of knowledge become. Humans have always had to deal with complexity. Felling a woolly mammoth is not simple. But now that we live in larger, more varied, faster-changing societies than ever before, curiosity is more important and more rewarding than it has ever been. This applies to who we need to know as well as what. Another striking thing about Leonardo's list is how many house visits he will have to make. His curiosity makes him highly sociable. Montaigne wrote of how travel to different regions and countries allows us to rub and polish our brains against others, and Leonardo seems keen to polish his brain against as many others as possible. Out of the 15 tasks in the complete list, at least 8 involve consultations with other people, and 2 involve other people's books. It is easy to imagine Leonardo eagerly approaching each expert, intent on drawing out their knowledge, beginning each conversation with Demi. People who are deeply curious are more likely to be good at collaboration. They seek out new acquaintances and allies in the process of building their stock of cultural knowledge. In the next chapter, we'll look more closely at the curiosity of babies and children, and at why some of them are more likely than others to grow into adults who share Leonardo's passionate curiosity. Chapter 2. How Curiosity Begins. If you were deciding which of the worlds, neighborhood scores highest for epistemic curiosity, Bloomsbury in London would be a strong candidate. At its heart is the British Museum, a global hub of inquiry and intellectual exchange for more than 250 years. Stroll down streets lined with elegant Georgian townhouses and mansion blocks, and your eye is caught by blue plaques denoting the former residences and workplaces of some of the modern world's most influential thinkers. Charles Darwin, Bertrand Russell, Virginia Woolf, John Maynard Keynes. Today those streets are thronged by the students and faculty of the University of London and its associated institutions. Push through the door of an anonymous-looking building just off Russell Square, and you find yourself at the entrance to a brightly colored playroom full of toys. It's not a daycare center, but the reception area for Baby Lab, where the mysteries of infant minds are studied. Baby Lab was created as part of Birkbeck College's drive to become a globally renowned center for the study of early cognitive development. Every week, dozens of tiny research subjects arrive, accompanied by their parents or caregivers, to play games in the name of science, enabling Birkbeck's researchers to get a little closer to understanding what's going on inside the newly minted human brain. On a February afternoon at Baby Lab, I meet two psychologists who are investigating the origins of epistemic curiosity, Teodora Gliga and Katerina Bigas. Gliga and Bigas introduce me to their new research subject. Guiu, whose mother is from Barcelona, is 9 months old. He is given a toy phone to play with while Bigas deftly slips a net of electrodes over his head. He is then carried into a small room with a camera in it, where, with the help of his mother, Bigas straps him into a chair facing a TV screen. For the next 5 minutes, a succession of toys of varying shapes and sizes are handed to Guiu by Bigas, while his mother stands by. Just outside the room, Gliga and I can view Guiu's reactions to the toys on 2 screens. One is a video feed, which will later be studied to assess how interested Guiu was in what was in front of him, how long he played with each toy, and where his gaze was directed. The other screen shows a series of wobbly parallel lines that spike unpredictably. This shows us roughly what's going on in Guiu's brain, as measured by the electrical activity detected by his electrode hairnet. It's easy to imagine that infants are in a permanent state of curiosity. Books on parenting, popular science accounts, and our incorrigibly sentimental view of children all conspire to suggest that babies spend every waking second lost in wonder. But although they are avidly inquisitive creatures, the curiosity of babies wanes and waxes, just as ours does. Sometimes babies are primed and ready to learn. Other times they are bored, or lost to imaginings, or just sleepy. Crucially, their level of curiosity is acutely responsive to what's around them, to their physical environment, and, above all, to their adult caregivers. Infant curiosity is codependent. Gliga and Bigas are trying to find a reliable way of measuring the extent of a baby's curiosity at any one moment. They have been running experiments, like the one I am witnessing today, to see if they can identify the particular state of the infant brain in the moment of epistemic curiosity. Their hypothesis, which they are still exploring, working with babies, like parenting requires immense patience, is that there is a particular neurological state, identifiable via a particular brainwave, that represents the moment when a baby is most willing and able to acquire knowledge. Once Guiu has been presented with all the toys in Bigas's box, his attention is captured by some colorful imagery on the TV screen in front of him. A series of images of the toys that he was just playing with is played back. Next to each is an image of a toy that bears a strong resemblance to it, but is subtly different. When Gliga and Bigas study the data from this experiment, they will look to see if there is any correlation between the amount of time and energy Guiu spends looking at the slightly different version of a particular toy and the amount of interest he previously showed in the original toy. Their reasoning is that if Guiu looks harder at the similar but different image of a toy, it's because he was interested in the original toy and is now eager to learn more about it. His curiosity has been piqued. Imagine a group of parents from different species getting together for coffee and discussing the progress of their offspring. The foal's father would be boasting that his son virtually walked out of the womb. The sheep's mother would be complaining about her young daughter's choice of sexual partner. Everyone would feel sorry for the human parents, 3 years old and barely able to feed itself. As a species, we are embarrassingly slow to mature. Foals are tottering around the paddock within a half hour of leaving the maternal womb. Babies aren't toddling until they are about 18 months old. Birds are evicted from the nest by their mothers within a couple of months. Humans move back into the parental home after college. Chimps go straight from weaning to puberty, while humans take another decade or so. Alison Gopnik points out, no creature spends more time dependent on others for its very existence than a human baby, and no creature takes on the burden of that dependence so long and so readily as a human adult. We call this protracted period of dependence on adult childhood. Our extended infancy has a hidden upside. It bequeaths the mature human a child's capacity to love, learn, and wonder why. Childhood means not having to commit to particular courses of action because adults are taking care of our survival. We can hang back, watch, question, and learn what works best for us before deciding which paths to take. Ultimately, it's this that makes Homo sapiens so adaptable and inventive. Without the necessity to fend for ourselves in those first 10 or 20 years, we can focus on learning about the niche into which we have been born and form our own ideas about it. That involves getting to know our physical environment, whether it be an igloo on the ice or a house in Islington. It also means learning to navigate our cultural environment, the world of gesture, symbol, and technology in which we find ourselves. John Locke, the 17th century English philosopher, famously conceived of the infant mind as a tabula rasa, or blank slate. We now know that this is not literally true. Scientists believe that babies are born with certain fundamental abilities to imitate, to recognize faces, to discern basic causal relationships. But Locke's insight, born from his revulsion at the violent intolerance that had seen England degenerate into a civil war between Catholics and Protestants, endures. Nobody is born Catholic or Protestant, Eskimo or Bedouin. Your sense of identity, of being a person, is formed by the cultural knowledge you learn, first from your parents and then from others. If culture is the citadel that keeps us safe and allows us to thrive, babies use curiosity like a rope to pull themselves over its battlements, and adults throw the rope down to them. Children are agents of their own learning. Rather than simply taking in information from their environment or following genetic instructions, babies make it their own business to find out about the world. Put a baby down anywhere and it will start stroking, licking, picking things up and putting them in its mouth, and later crawling, walking, and running. Scientists at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development in Maryland recently discovered something extraordinary. The more actively a baby explores his or her environment, the more likely it is that he or she will go on to achieve academic success as an adolescent. The researchers measured the propensity of 374 5-month-old babies to crawl and probe and fiddle, and then tracked their progress over the following 14 years. They found that the ones doing best at school age 14 were the ones who had been the most energetically exploratory babies. But it is in the social world and the cultures in which our social worlds exist that babies and toddlers really exert and build their cognitive muscles. Any parent of a young child knows that small children love to run psychological tests on adults, testing their limits. The naughtiness of infants is experimental, a method of data collection. When a mother tells her son not to eat dirt, he immediately wonders what will happen if he does and how his mother will react. The child who pushes over his elder sister's carefully constructed tower of play blocks is doing so not just to watch the structure collapse, but to see his sister explode. At first, children hypothesize that there is no difference between what others are thinking and what they are thinking, that everyone is thinking the same thing. Then they notice that the theory doesn't hold. Different people seem to say and want different things, becoming upset when they don't get them, or happy when they do. That's when children become interested in what's going on in those other minds, when empathic curiosity begins. Before even this stage, children are sophisticated mimics, imitating adult behavior even when they don't know why they're doing so, yet quite capable of discriminating between the adults worth imitating and those best ignored. All this time, they are gathering cultural information, learning how to express themselves about right and wrong, about what's considered acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior. One of the most important things they learn about is whether it's good to learn. Right from the beginning, curiosity is a joint venture. Bigas and Gliga are seeking to unlock one of the mysteries of child development, why some babies grow into highly curious children and others don't. Their working hypothesis is that there are two factors involved. First, the child's basic cognitive ability, or intelligence, and second, the responses children receive to their nascent inquiries from parents and caregivers in those first years. One of Bigas and Gliga's experiments centers on a deceptively simple action, pointing. Most babies start to gesture toward things sometime around their first birthday, and soon they are doing so with their index finger. When a child points, she is initiating what psychologists call joint attention, getting you to pay attention to what she's paying attention to. Pointing is crucial to childhood development. The frequency with which a child points correlates to the speed with which she acquires language. Children who don't point tend to have difficulties in learning language, following social cues, and learning from others. It's impossible to know for sure why babies point, because they can't tell us. But we can make good guesses. For instance, that they are pointing to things they want or simply to engage their mother's attention. Gliga and Begas think that infants often point to something to signal their interest in it. The child wants to know more about something and expects their parent to tell them about it. Before they are able to speak, they are asking a question with their finger. In one study conducted with 16-month-old babies, Begas played games with the babies that involved everyday objects with which the infants were familiar, such as a book or a cup, together with some unfamiliar toys that Begas had made herself. She and the baby explored the objects together. With some babies, Begas acted as you would expect a knowledgeable adult to. She named the familiar objects correctly and helped the baby label and explore the unfamiliar objects when the baby pointed at them. With other babies, Begas played the fool. She pretended not to know what the familiar objects were or got them all wrong, calling a cup a shoe. What she found was that the babies in the second condition were much less likely to engage in pointing behavior than the babies in the first condition. It is sobering to think that even at such an early age, infants are capable of telling whether or not you're an idiot, a judgment that, when you think about it, demands substantial cognitive and social abilities. But this had been shown before. What was new about this study was its evidence that pointing is about learning from others and that whether children point depends on the adult they're with. When faced with someone clearly ignorant or unreliable, babies stop pointing. If you're unlikely to give them good information, there's no point. The same principles apply to a baby's babbling. Babies start to babble a few months after birth, and they do so in similar ways all over the world, regardless of which culture they are from. After writing this behavior off as unimportant for many years, scientists now think of it as a key marker of cognitive and social development and an essential precursor to speech. Michael Goldstein, an associate professor of psychology at Cornell University, has looked at how babies learn the names of objects with which they are unfamiliar. He found that they are more likely to learn these new words when they are offered in response to the baby's babbling. In that moment of babbling, babies seem to be primed to take in more information, he says. It's about creating a social interaction where now you can learn new things. Babbling, like pointing, is a sign of readiness to learn. And babies are also more likely to use it as a tool of curiosity if their parents respond to it as such. If, rather than ignoring them, they try to answer whatever they think the baby's unintelligible question might be. If a baby looks at an apple and says da 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 and the adult says nothing, the baby not only fails to learn the name of that round greenish object, but also starts to think that this whole babbling business might be a waste of time. Curiosity supercharges learning, even in these early months and years. In a separate study, Begas showed 2 novel objects to each baby. The toys were simple puzzles, responding in interesting ways to pushes or pulls or brushes in the right places. After presenting the 2 objects, Begas waited for the baby to point to one of them. Then she demonstrated how one of the objects worked, choosing either the object the baby pointed to or the one he hadn't. Next, Begas took the objects away and, 10 minutes later, brought them back to observe whether the baby played with them in the way they had been shown. Babies were much more likely to replicate her actions correctly with the object in which they had been interested in the first place. It's remarkable that even in the course of 15 minutes in the laboratory, an adult can elicit a lot or a little curiosity from an infant, depending on how she behaves. This is one of the secrets of curiosity. We don't get allocated a fixed amount of it at birth. Instead, we inherit a mercurial quality that rises and falls through the day and throughout our lives. What's more, its progress is deeply affected by the behavior of people around us, especially in those first months and years. In the same study, Begas observed the infants at play with their parents. She found that children whose parents responded more to their promptings and asked more questions in return were the children who learned most about how their chosen object could be used. Here, then, is the most likely answer to the question that Begas and Gliga are investigating. To a surprisingly large extent, whether a child is highly curious or incurious depends on how their parents responded to these early unspoken queries. Curiosity is a feedback loop. What do children think pointing is for? That depends on how they see adults react when they do it. If they just get given the object they're pointing to, they learn that the function of pointing is getting things, Gliga told me. If they get told the name of the object, then they learn to think of it as a way of getting information. What happens if they get neither? I asked. If they receive no response to their signal, they stop pointing. In most ways, children become more independent of adults as they grow older. But when it comes to curiosity, adults become more important to children as time goes by. As any parent knows, children ask questions, a lot of questions. In 2007, psychologist Michelle Chenard analyzed recordings of 4 children interacting with their respective caregivers for 2 hours at a time, for a total of more than 200 hours. She found that, on average, the children posed more than 100 questions every hour. Some of the questions were requests or calls for attention, but about 2/3 were designed to elicit information, such as, "What is the name for that?" Question asking, concluded Chenard, is not something that happens every now and then. Asking questions is a central part of what it means to be a child. As children grow older, their questions become more probing. They start to ask for explanations, rather than merely information. Chenard found that up until the age of about 30 months, children mostly ask what and where questions. What's that? Or what does it do? Or where's my ball? Or what is he doing? These are questions designed to elicit facts. Then, sometime around their 3rd birthday, they start to ask how and why questions designed to elicit explanations. This type of question becomes more frequent as the child grows. When conversing with a familiar adult at home, preschoolers ask explanatory questions at a rate of about 25 times an hour. Paul Harris, a professor of education at Harvard, is an expert on children's question asking. Extrapolating from Chenard's data, he estimates that between the ages of 2 and 5, children ask a total of 40,000 explanatory questions. That's an amazing number, he says. It shows that questioning is an incredibly important engine for cognitive development. These explanatory questions can be profound or silly, perceptive or incomprehensible, stirring or hilarious. Here's a random sample of questions from my friend's children, all of whom were under 10 years old when they asked them. When I am 16, will all of you adults be dead? What happens if your eyes turn into flies? What is time? Did you used to be a monkey? Why can't I run away from my shadow? If I'm made from a bit of mummy and a bit of daddy, then where does the bit that's me come from? Will I die on the cross like Jesus? Paul Harris points out that asking a question requires a complex mental process. The child has to first realize that there are things they don't know, that there are invisible worlds of knowledge they have never visited. They also have to realize that other people are information-bearing agents, and that language can be used as a tool for shifting stuff from that person to them. The question is a technology that children use to trawl for insights. As Harris remarks, it's striking that the questions children ask aren't restricted to immediate goals, like what's for dinner or how to make a toy work. They probe the how and why of things, sometimes tenaciously, even if it yields no tangible rewards. Every question is a little bet. From a very young age, children sense that any information they can gather, even if it doesn't have an immediate application, may come in useful in the future. Some of their questions will lead to dead ends, confusion, or evasions from embarrassed parents. But cumulatively, their questions bring knowledge, and with more knowledge the child knows that he is growing just as surely as she knows she will exceed this year's chalk mark on the wall chart next year. The incuriosity of Kanzi, the highly intelligent bonobo ape, wasn't a mere problem of linguistic complexity. Michelle Chenard noted that even before they learn language, children can vocalize information-gathering questions. For example, one mother was unpacking her groceries when her child picked up an unfamiliar item, a kiwi fruit, and held it toward her mother with a puzzled expression on her face and the monosyllabic but perfectly expressive question, Children sometimes ask questions simply by repeating what they have heard. Researchers observed two 3-year-old twins, David and Toby, talking to each other. David said, "My hands are cold." "Cold?" asked Toby. "Kanzi doesn't even do this." Unlike human children, Kanzi doesn't seem to have grasped that communication can be an exchange of information, or that there are others who know more about the world than he does. Children intuitively understand, says Harris, that adults can be trustworthy informers about hidden reality. Children are scientists, experimenting on their physical environment, but they are also investigative reporters, pumping their sources for secrets. We're so used to the idea of being able to ask questions that we've forgotten what an amazing skill or set of skills it is. First, you have to know that you don't know, to conceive of your own ignorance. Second, you have to be able to imagine different, competing possibilities. When a child asks whether ghosts are real or made up, she is already imagining alternative explanations. Third, you have to understand that you can learn from other people. None of these abilities is shared by other primates, and neither is their development in human children simple or inevitable. Under different conditions, they can flourish or atrophy. When we're adults, we can shape those conditions in the right way, as long as we know how to do so. But a young child can't do this. Her curiosity is shaped for her by parents and caregivers. Most parents, including this one, can get impatient with the incessant curiosity of children, with their pointing, babbling, and question asking. It's hard to engage with every one of our child's inquiries when we're trying to make dinner, talk to a friend, finish an email, or just relax. These days, it's increasingly easy to fob them off to our electronic child minders. Technology is a great aid in getting parents off the hook of our children's curiosity. We can drop them in front of the TV, give them a cell phone to play with, or hand them an iPad with their favorite game on it. It's not the worst thing you can do to a child. But after talking to the experts and learning about how children learn, I'm now painfully aware that every time I ignore my daughter's questions, I may be stunting her innate desire to know. Puzzles and mysteries. Henry James remarked wistfully that our purely intellectual zeal ebbs as we become adults. In each of us, a saturation point is soon reached. We settle into an equilibrium and live on what we learned when our interest was fresh and instinctive. According to educational psychologist Susan Engel, curiosity begins to wane as young as 4 years old. By the time we are adults, we have fewer questions and more default settings. As James put it, disinterested curiosity is past, the mental grooves and channels set. The decline in curiosity can be traced in the development of the brain through childhood. Though smaller than the adult brain, the infant brain contains millions more neural connections. The wiring, however, is a mess. The lines of communication between infant neurons are far less efficient than between those in the adult brain. The baby's perception of the world is consequently both intensely rich and wildly disordered. As children absorb more evidence from the world around them, certain possibilities become much more likely and more useful and harden into knowledge or beliefs. The neural pathways that enable those beliefs become faster and more automatic, while the ones that the child doesn't use regularly are pruned away. An overgrown garden becomes less abundant and more orderly. This waning of curiosity is not necessarily a bad thing. It's essential in becoming a person who can act on the world, rather than one helplessly enthralled to it, hostage to every passing stimulus. Computer scientists talk about the difference between exploring and exploiting. A system will learn more if it explores many possibilities, but it will be more effective if it simply acts on the most likely one. As babies grow into children and then into adults, they begin to do more exploiting of whatever knowledge they have acquired. As adults, however, we have a tendency to err too far toward exploitation. We become content to fall back on the stock of knowledge and mental habits we built up when we were young, rather than adding to or revising it. We get lazy. In finding the right balance between these two strategies, it's helpful to understand how curiosity works. This isn't a simple question. Over the years, psychologists have had a hard time coming to grips with curiosity despite, presumably, being on intimate terms with it themselves. It's a strange and baffling combination of capacities. Psychologists tend to divide the human psyche into intellect, emotions, and drives, and the major explanations of curiosity emphasize only one part of this trinity. But curiosity seems to issue from all three at once. As a result, none of the existing theories is entirely satisfactory. One theory, dominant in the first half of the 20th century, conceives of curiosity as a biological drive, like the urge to satisfy hunger or sexual desire. But instead of being satisfied by food or sex, the curiosity drive is satiated only by information. Just as we invest time and effort in acquiring the first two, the theory goes we do the same with information because humans need knowledge to survive and thrive. The fourth drive thus grows out of the other three. Sigmund Freud, to whom this theory can be traced, argued specifically that intellectual curiosity derives from the drive for sex. This makes some intuitive sense. We speak about people being driven by curiosity or having an appetite for knowledge. Curiosity, when we're in the grip of it, isn't always far from sexual desire. Indeed, the two can merge into voyeurism. The shortcoming of this theory is that it doesn't help to distinguish between the different kinds of knowledge people get interested in, from the sensory to the intellectual, the useful to the useless. Is the desire to know more about the religious rituals of Mayan civilization really the same as the desire to know what Ryan Gosling looks like with his clothes off? The other problem with classifying curiosity this way is that it behaves differently from our other drives. When I finish a large meal, I may have no wish to eat again for a long time. But when I read an article on a topic I'm fascinated by, I immediately want to read more. Not being satisfied is what makes curiosity so satisfying. The great developmental psychologist Jean Piaget framed curiosity as more of a cognitive activity, deriving from our deep intellectual need to make sense of the world. He proposed that a person's curiosity is provoked when she perceives an incongruity between what she expects and what happens, when she feels there's a discrepancy between what she thinks she knows and what she sees. Piaget said that this helps us understand why children are bursting with curiosity and wonder. They are operating on a few very simple theories about how the world works. Because much of what they witness every day doesn't fit those theories. Nearly everything is a surprise, demanding explanation. Curiosity is at its highest when the violation of an expectation is more than tiny and less than enormous. When violations are minor, we can easily ignore them. When they're massive, we often refuse to acknowledge them because we're scared of what they imply. Incongruity theory, however, doesn't explain why I try to overhear a conversation at the next table or why you have an enduring desire to learn as much as you can about the Crimean War. In 1994, George Lowenstein, a psychologist and behavioral economist from Carnegie Mellon University, created a synthesis of these two approaches, the instinctual and the cognitive. According to Lowenstein, curiosity is a response to an information gap. We feel curious where there is a gap between what we know and what we want to know. It's not only incongruity that evokes our desire to know, it's the absence of information. Information gaps often come in the form of questions. What's in the box? Why is that man crying? What's a four-letter word meaning suffering? You have some incomplete information. There is a box. There is a man crying. There is a crossword clue, and you want to find the missing part. Lowenstein's theory is deceptively simple, but it tells us something profound. To grasp it fully, we need to know something about the thinker who most influenced Lowenstein's ideas about curiosity, Daniel Berline. Born in Safford, near Manchester, in 1924 and educated at Cambridge, Daniel Berline spent most of his career as a psychologist in North America and continental Europe, including a year with Jean Piaget in Geneva. Berline was interested in why people get interested in things, and in particular why they get interested in the strange, the unusual, the puzzling. In 1954, while at the University of Aberdeen, He published a paper that first made the seminal distinction between diversive and epistemic curiosity. Berline exemplified both. He loved the thrill of exploration, physical and intellectual. During his adult life, he moved from England to Scotland, to California, to Switzerland, Paris, and Toronto. His research ranged across topics barely covered by his peers, such as the psychology of artistic appreciation or humor. He was also a man of deep and enduring interests, as knowledgeable about Aristotle and Michelangelo as he was about Freud and Pavlov. He was fluent in 6 languages and an avid collector of books, paintings, jokes, and underground train journeys. Berline used to give his experimental subjects geometric shapes, such as polygons, to look at. The shapes and the patterns within them would vary in complexity. He found that if people were presented with simple shapes, they would barely glance at them before getting bored. They would spend more time gazing at the shapes if they were more complex. But if the patterns were extremely complex, people didn't spend much time on them either. This simple experiment illuminated a deep truth about curiosity, one that cognitive psychologist Janet Metcalfe of Columbia University, who first told me about these experiments, described as beautiful and inspiring. Berline had put his finger on a paradoxical attribute of curiosity. It is stimulated by understanding and by the absence of understanding. This tells us something important about the motivation to learn. Lowenstein built his information gap theory out of Berline's insight. Information, he proposed, fuels curiosity by creating awareness of ignorance, which gives rise to a desire to know more. As soon as we know something about a subject, we start to become uncomfortably aware of what we don't know, and that makes us want to close the gap. William James anticipated Lowenstein when he said that scientific curiosity arises from a gap in knowledge, just as the musical brain responds to discord. The crucial point here is that it's not simply the absence of information that creates curiosity, but a gap in our existing information. Curiosity is talked about as if it's a feeling that occurs when we don't know anything, but this neglects the role that a little knowledge plays in stimulating it. People tend not to be curious about things of which they are completely ignorant. German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach remarked that man only wants to know what man can know. What lies beyond this region has no existence whatever for him. So for him, it is also the object of no drive or wish whatsoever. In Swann's Way, Marcel Proust describes his protagonist as lacking even the tiny initial clue which, by allowing us to imagine what we do not know, stimulates a desire for knowledge. When we know nothing about a subject, we find it hard to engage our brains, either because we can't imagine finding it interesting, or because we're intimidated by the prospect of starting to learn about something that might, by its scale or complexity, defeat us. Conversely, when we know a lot about a subject and feel that we have pretty much got it covered, we're unlikely to be interested in more information about it. In between these two states is what experts on learning call the zone of proximal learning. For the sake of simplicity, I'll call it the curiosity zone. The curiosity zone is next door to what you already know, just before you feel you know too much. Thinking about curiosity like this helps us to distinguish between people who are truly incurious and people who only appear incurious because they don't have basic knowledge about the topic. If I tell you something about opera and you know absolutely nothing about opera, you're unlikely to be interested in discussing it, which would also be the case if you think you already know everything there is to know about opera. However, that doesn't make you an incurious person. Say that soccer is a topic you do know something about. You might suddenly become very curious if I then drop a fascinating fact about Manchester United into the conversation. Children and adults who are dismissed as incurious may be suffering from a different problem, a lack of basic information about the subject at hand. Unless you're in the curiosity zone, it's difficult to become interested in anything. Lowenstein explained that this is the most important implication of his theory. I don't believe in the idea that some people are really curious and others are really incurious, he said. Sure, there are individual differences, but what really counts is the context in which you encounter new information. And the most important contextual factor is knowledge. The more we know about something, the more intense our curiosity is about what we don't know. Berline found that when he gave people lists of questions about animals and asked them to rate how curious they were about the answers, they were most curious about the animals they already knew something about. Lowenstein pointed out that a person who knows the capitals of 3 out of 50 American states is likely to think of herself as knowing something. But a person who has learned the names of 47 state capitals is likely to think of herself as not knowing 3 state capitals. She's likely to want to learn those last 3 and will make an effort to do so. Curiosity rises in tandem with knowledge. The intensity of our curiosity is affected by whether we think the information that we're missing is likely to provide insight. After all, not all information is equal. Sometimes, new information adds only a little to existing information. Other times, it will throw light on an entire problem. Lowenstein described a study in which subjects sat in front of computer screens that were divided into a grid of 45 blank squares. Clicking on a square revealed a hidden image. In one condition, each square contained a different animal. In the other, each revealed part of what was one animal, filling the entire screen. Subjects in the first condition tended to get bored after realizing that each square concealed a different animal. Those in the second condition were much more likely to keep clicking because they wanted to comprehend the big picture. In order to feel curious, to fill the desired to close an information gap, you have to be aware of a gap in your knowledge in the first place. The trouble is, most of us, most of the time, go around thinking we know everything. Psychologists have demonstrated overconfidence effects in many areas of our lives. Most people think they're a better than average driver, or parent, or lover. This is as true of the way we assess our own knowledge as it is of anything else. We're not very good at spotting our own information gaps, and that inclines us to be less curious than we ought to be. In 1987, researchers at the University of Oklahoma ran an experiment in which they gave students a series of problems to solve and asked them to generate as many solutions as they could. The researchers deliberately gave their subjects a limited amount of information on each problem. One problem was how to provide enough parking spaces on the university campus, given the finite space available. The students came up with about 300 solutions in 7 different categories, including reducing demand for parking space or using the space more efficiently. After the students had generated their answers, they were asked to estimate what percentage of possible good solutions they thought they had come up with. Separately, a panel of experts had been asked to compile a database of the possible solutions. Understandably, given their efforts, the individuals guessed that they had landed on 3 out of 4 possible solutions. However, when their answers were matched against the experts' database, it turned out that the average participant had generated only about 1 in 3 of the best solutions. The participants had missed most of the best ideas. Think of this as the ignorant but happy effect. When people are confident that they have the answers, they become blithely incurious about alternatives. Lowenstein pointed out that this effect can help us understand our lazy assumptions in everyday life, such as the way we tend to slot other people into stereotypes. I might assume that my taxi driver's conversation won't extend beyond the weather and sports. If I exercise my curiosity a little more, I might find out about his PhD in sociology. Many prejudices can be explained by a failure to perceive the gaps in one's information. It's certainly a lot easier to go through life assuming you know everything that needs to be known. Nobel Prize. Winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman put it like this: our comforting conviction the world makes sense rests on a secure foundation, our almost unlimited ability to ignore our ignorance. If overconfidence undermines curiosity, so does a complete lack of confidence. As psychologist Todd Kashdan has said, anxiety and curiosity are 2 opposing systems. Fear kills curiosity. Children who grow up in environments of profound physical or emotional uncertainty often seem to be incurious at school, but it's because they can't afford to concentrate on anything other than survival. They need to attend to who is on their side and who isn't, on how to avoid the worst from the grown-ups on whose care they depend, or with whose carelessness they are stuck. That takes up most of their cognitive resources, with little left over for playful exploration. The dynamic between overconfidence and underconfidence equally applies to adult life. Take businesses, for example. Firms in which employees live in fear of their jobs are unlikely to have environments conducive to curious thinking. Equally, firms in which employees feel that everything is going swimmingly and their bonuses are ensured are also likely to see curiosity wither. Curiosity requires an edge of uncertainty to thrive. Too much uncertainty and it freezes. Curiosity has been called the knowledge emotion. An information gap isn't simply recognized rationally. Its onset is like an itch that we have to scratch. Information gaps cause us pain, but it's a pain we invite in. In evolutionary terms, the primary role of emotions is motivational. Anger makes us act to change a bad situation or right a wrong. Love binds us to someone even when they disappoint us. The emotional force of curiosity is what impels us forward on our intellectual explorations, even when there is no pressing need to do so, and keeps us inquiring even when we're weary or confused. A curious person knows that she won't feel emotionally fulfilled until she finds the information or the understanding she seeks. So she keeps reading or questioning until the gap is closed. That's not to say that the curious person can ever feel completely satisfied. Philosopher John Stuart Mill, after suffering a childhood in which he was force-fed massive amounts of knowledge by his overbearing father, still managed to discover the pleasures of self-directed intellectual exploration as an adult. He held that it is better to be a human being satisfied than a pig dissatisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Curiosity is the sweetest form of dissatisfaction. If curiosity is emotionally complex, that's because we are. Here is Leonardo da Vinci describing his investigation of a cave. I came to the entrance of a great cavern, in front of which I stood some time, astonished and unaware of such a thing. Bending my back into an arch, I rested my left hand on my knee, and held my right hand over my downcast and contracted eyebrows, often bending first one way and then the other, to see whether I could discover anything inside, and this being forbidden by the deep darkness within. And after having remained there some time, two contrary emotions arose in me: fear and desire. Fear of the threatening dark cavern, desire to see whether there were any marvelous thing within it. This is what being human entails. We spend our entire lives at the entrance of a cave, caught between the safety of the familiar and the yearning for novelty, the peace of home and the thrill of travel, the tonic and dominant chords. Toddlers in the park will wander off to explore, then run back to their parents, then venture away again. Our stories, from the Odyssey to the Searchers to Harry Potter, revolve around these two conflicting instincts to strike out or stay home. This brings us to another paradox. The more we love home, the more likely we are to strike out. In 1970, psychologists Mary Salter Ainsworth and Sylvia Bell of Johns Hopkins University ran a series of experiments in which they put a 1-year-old child in a room with its mother and some toys. The mother left the room, while the researchers watched how the child reacted to her departure. Then she returned, and this was the part that Salter Ainsworth and Bell were really interested in. The infants with a secure attachment to their mother greeted her joyfully, before returning to their exploration of the room and its toys. Those with a more troubled relationship also greeted their mother's return, but were then much less likely to return to their explorations, as if fearful that if they turned their backs again, their mother would disappear. In developmental psychologist Susan Engel's summary of the study's findings, insecure children are less likely to make physical and psychological expeditions to gather information. Curiosity is underwritten by love. Information gaps make good bait. When you read about a murder and you don't know who committed it, your curiosity is aroused. The information, Mr. Ratchet has been stabbed to death on the Orient Express, engages your attention. The gap, nobody knows who did it, sucks you in. You've learned something which makes you want to know more. And in the hands of a master storyteller like Agatha Christie, this sets up a magnetic current of curiosity that pulls you through the rest of the book. In the early years of the last decade, I lived and worked in New York, where I was lucky enough to attend a seminar given by the great Robert McKee, the godfather of screenwriting teachers. Just about every successful screenwriter, and many more unsuccessful ones, have sat in one of McKee's classes or read his magnum opus, Story. For 2 days, a cantankerous white-haired man with a rasping, cigarette-burn voice held an audience of hundreds spellbound, speaking largely without notes or props. McKee spoke about what distinguishes a good movie from a bad one, and, more specifically, the fundamental structure of great stories. Sure, said McKee, a movie can have amazing special effects or deep existential ideas, but it will be great only if it rests on the foundation of a well-constructed story. Stories depend on the artful manipulation of what Lowenstein calls information gaps. In McKee's words, curiosity is the intellectual need to answer questions and close open patterns. Story plays to this universal desire by doing the opposite, posing questions and opening situations. The storyteller plays a cat-and-mouse game with the viewer, opening and closing information gaps as the narrative unfolds, unspooling the viewer's curiosity. According to McKee, every scene in a movie should be a turning point. Each turning point hooks curiosity. The audience wonders, what will happen next? And how will it turn out? What will happen next is a question that can pin us to our chairs, raise our heartbeats, and make us sweat. Alfred Hitchcock was expert at creating painful information gaps in the minds of his viewers, consisting precisely of this question. He was a perfect judge of how much his viewers should be allowed to know in any given scene and what should be withheld from them. He turned their curiosity into a thumbscrew. One of his maxims was, always make the audience suffer as much as possible. Hitchcock was an information sadist. You can take the opening scene of any movie and identify the information it gives you and the gaps it leaves. In Citizen Kane, for instance, we learn that a millionaire tycoon has died and that his last word was rosebud. We are left to wonder what rosebud refers to and why it's significant until the end. Sometimes, information gaps are the whole point of the narrative, as in a murder mystery. At other times, they are introduced to generate momentum so that the storyteller can explore his wider themes. Alfred Hitchcock called his information gaps MacGuffins, simple devices that moved his plots along. The best storytellers in any medium are artful shapers of the narrative, equivalent to what designers call negative space, the shapes that lie between what is visible. George Orwell economically sculpts an information gap with the opening sentence of 1984. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. You want to read on to find out why the clocks work differently in this world. In some stories, an information gap is deliberately left unclosed at the end. Just what did Bill Murray whisper to Scarlett Johansson in Lost in Translation? What is it that Meatloaf won't do for love? It's not only artists who use information gaps this way. Advertisers are fond of teaser campaigns, in which unbranded ads are used to stoke the curiosity of consumers before the main campaign reveals what it's all about. In the workplace, skillful presenters will often start by posing a question to the people in the room that they answer fully only after exploring several alternatives. When the presenter finally arrives at the answer, her audience is then more likely to believe it's the right one, because its members are experiencing the emotional satisfaction of closing an information gap. Some people are expert users of information gaps in conversation. They might refer in passing to the time they met Fidel Castro, knowing that until they close that gap, they have you hooked. You may be thinking that some of these tricks might be more likely to annoy you than interest you. You may also wonder whether Agatha Christie is the highest example of the storyteller's art or whether stories, and the curiosity they arouse, can serve deeper purposes. To a certain extent, the irritation created by a narrative trick or a teaser campaign is beside the point if the author has made you read on or notice his product. But I'd say your annoyance is significant because it points to a gap in Lowenstein's theory of information gaps. Curiosity is about more than the hunt for missing information. Lowenstein's definition of curiosity is powerful, but it's even more useful with a modification. He proposes that curiosity is about finding the answer in order to salve our frustration at the gap where the information should be. But when we come upon a field of knowledge that we feel sure will occupy us for a long time to come, whether it's neuroscience or languages, it's because we know we'll never get to the end of our ignorance. That feeling isn't uncomfortable, or, as the psychologists say, aversive. It is enormously affirming. Something like the confidence you feel when you ask your partner to marry you. It's a very different feeling from the one you get when you're trying to fill in the last clue in a crossword puzzle. So what kind of curiosity is this? Security and intelligence expert Gregory Treverton once made a very useful distinction between puzzles and mysteries. Puzzles have definite answers. When you're trying to answer that crossword clue, you know the kind of answer you need, even if you don't know what it is yet. Even when you don't know the answer, you know the question, and you know that a corresponding answer exists. Puzzles are orderly. They have a beginning and an end. Once the missing information is found, it's not a puzzle anymore. The frustration you felt when you were searching for the answer is replaced by satisfaction. Mysteries are murkier, less neat. They pose questions that can't be answered definitively, because the answers often depend on a highly complex and interrelated set of factors, both known and unknown. They tend to involve slippery concepts such as public opinion and human psychology. Progress can be made towards solving them by gathering knowledge and identifying the most important factors. But they don't offer the satisfaction of definite solutions. The problem here isn't an information gap, necessarily. Indeed, sometimes the problem is that there is too much information. But in knowing which information is important and which isn't, and how to interpret the information you have. Puzzles tend to be how many or where questions. Mysteries are more likely to be why or how. Treverton was writing about how the job of U.S. intelligence had changed since the era of the Cold War, when America's spies and analysts were tasked mainly with solving puzzles. How many missiles did the Soviet Union possess? Where were they? How fast could they travel? With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of global terrorism, the primary task of intelligence became to define the most important mysteries. We have a tendency to prioritize puzzles over mysteries because we know they can be solved. The question, where is Osama bin Laden, was a puzzle, and when it was solved there was great jubilation. How best to combat Islamist terrorism, arguably a much more important question, is a mystery, but it receives far less attention among the public and in the media because it is so complex and seemingly intractable. Treverton suggested that if U.S. intelligence had treated the question of Saddam's Iraq not as a puzzle, does Iraq possess weapons of mass destruction? But as a mystery, then it might have landed on the insight that Saddam was boasting about weapons he didn't have. This distinction has applications far beyond the field of national security. Puzzles and mysteries correspond to different types of curiosity. To illustrate this, let's return to stories. Agatha Christie constructed puzzles in which a key piece of information, the identity of the murderer, is withheld until the end. The reader's desire to discover who committed the murder is transient. When he finds out that it was Colonel Barker with strychnine, he gains the pleasure of discovery. But at the same moment, his curiosity dies. The curiosity inspired by, say, The Great Gatsby is of a different order. It is deeper and longer lived. It invites you to ponder questions that have no definite answer. What kind of a man is J. Gatsby? What is the meaning of the green light? What is the true nature of the American dream? The reader or viewer can return to these stories and these questions over and over, their curiosity engaged but never sated. Scott Fitzgerald's novels sell fewer copies than Agatha Christie's, but they offer more profound satisfactions. Truly ambitious artists are more interested in mysteries than puzzles. One way of describing the achievement of the TV series The Wire was that it took a genre, the police procedural, which is conventionally based on puzzles in the form of crimes that are solved each week, and turned it into a mystery, the mystery of Baltimore's crime problem. Earlier, I mentioned the role that Rosebud plays in Citizen Kane. Its introduction at the beginning of the movie creates an information gap, because it seems to be the key that will explain Kane's life to us. When, at the end of the film, the gap is closed, Rosebud was Kane's childhood sled, we feel disappointed, because it doesn't really seem to explain anything. Orson Welles knew what he was doing. He was playing with the conventions of popular narratives, which rely on puzzles to manipulate the reader's or viewer's attention. Welles was suggesting that a man's inner life is a mystery, not a puzzle, and that the meaning of a life is a question to which there are no easy answers. In his book Will in the World, Literary scholar Stephen Greenblatt identifies a key turning point in the artistic evolution of William Shakespeare. Up until the mid-1590s, Shakespeare was happy to adapt conventional storylines to his own ends, borrowing his plots from legends and chronicles. But at a certain point, Greenblatt connects it to the death of the playwright's beloved son. Hamlet, Shakespeare started to take these older narrative structures and remove crucial planks from them, in a way that made it harder for his audience to understand why his characters acted the way they did. It was as if he had lost faith in the comprehensibility of the universe, and he wanted his own stories to reflect that. In Greenblatt's words, the principle was not the making of a riddle, but the creation of a strategic opacity. Take the play considered by many to be Shakespeare's greatest. Hamlet was based on an ancient Scandinavian legend. Shakespeare took this old story and made a crucial change to the plot. In the original version, it is public knowledge that the prince's father was murdered by the current king. Hamlet, the prince, is therefore expected to avenge his father's killer. But Hamlet is still young, a boy, and needs to bide his time. So he feigns madness as a way of avoiding the attentions of the king's henchmen while he makes plans for revenge. In Shakespeare's version, our hero is already a young man, and the murder is a secret, revealed exclusively to Hamlet by his father's ghost. Hamlet's feigned madness and his delay are therefore entirely unnecessary and not easy to understand or explain. As a consequence, Shakespeare's Hamlet still fascinates us centuries later, whereas Hamlet is forgotten despite being more easily understood, actually, because he is more easily understood. Mysteries have a longer half-life than puzzles. Great scientists and inventors think in terms of mysteries rather than puzzles too. They are more interested in uncertainty than certainty. Physicist Freeman Dyson has remarked that science is not a collection of truths, but a continuing exploration of mysteries. Ray Dolby, the American inventor and audio pioneer, eloquently expressed how this principle applies to innovation. To be an inventor, you have to be willing to live with a sense of uncertainty, to work in the darkness and grope toward an answer, to put up with the anxiety about whether there is an answer. It's a sentiment Albert Einstein would have recognized. The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious, he said. It is the source of all true art and science. We live in a culture that is keener on puzzles than mysteries. In school and even in college, science is presented as a series of questions corresponding with neatly defined answers, rather than, as Dyson would have it, the rigorous and persistent exploration of what we don't know. Politicians tend to think of educational policy as a puzzle, in which the aim is to match inputs with specific outputs. Indeed, they present all of society's complex problems as if they are puzzles with simple answers. The media like to turn life into a series of puzzles that can be solved by watching a television program, or buying a book, or a product. Business people prefer to frame their problems as puzzles because puzzles and their solutions are more easily articulated in a few bullet points on a PowerPoint chart and more easily measured. Google can give us the powerful illusion that all questions have definite answers. We need to resist this cultural pressure. Puzzles offer us the satisfaction of answering a question, even while you're missing the point completely. A society or an organization that thinks only in terms of puzzles is one that is too focused on the goals it has set, rather than on the possibilities it can't yet see. A person who thinks of every problem in their life as a puzzle will feel confused and frustrated at the way some questions don't resolve themselves into simple answers. Mysteries are more challenging, but more sustaining. They inspire long-term curiosity by keeping us focused on what we don't know. They keep us feeling alive and active, even as we work in the darkness. In the final assignment of third grade, Jack was asked to research the anaconda. After spending 3 hours on the internet, he produced a detailed report on the animal, dense with facts. It touched on the snake's habitat, prey, and size. Jack was proud of his report, and after presenting it to his teacher, he brought it to his father to read. "It's the largest snake in the world," he told his father. His father replied with a question. "What's the second largest snake in the world?" Jack frowned slightly. Then he turned away, walked back to his bedroom, and started tapping at his computer keyboard. Within a minute, he came back and told his father the answer. This little exchange is not particularly remarkable. Versions of it take place thousands of times a day in households across the world. In any home with an internet connection, questions are answered with the assistance of Google and Wikipedia. Indeed, the only reason we know about this one is that Jack's father is the writer Ben Greenman, who wrote about it for the New York Times. Greenman wrote that he felt it said something about the difference between the way his son acquires knowledge and the way that he did as a child. About a month after the Anaconda conversation with his son, Greenman picked up the S volume of an old encyclopedia and turned to the page on snakes. He read information he knew already and information he didn't. What the encyclopedia entry on snakes didn't tell him was what the second biggest snake was. He read closely, but there was no search function, no second largest entry. Greenman reflected that if he'd been asked the question when he was a child, he might, after a fruitless search in his family's encyclopedia, have been motivated enough to visit the library and check out a book on snakes. More likely, though, he would have gotten on with his life in 3rd and later 4th grade, faintly feeling the itch of the unanswered question at the back of his mind. The internet's ability to scratch such itches in an instant is, Greenman argues, a mixed blessing. By supplying answers to questions with such ruthless efficiency, the internet cuts off the supply of an even more valuable commodity, productive frustration. Education, at least as I remember it, isn't only, or even primarily, about creating children who are proficient with information. It's about filling them with questions that ripen, by a deferral, into genuine interests. Greenman eloquently describes the way that the internet closes information gaps and, by doing so, forecloses curiosity. It has a tendency to turn mysteries into puzzles and puzzles into instantly answered questions. Our children are used to finding definitive answers to even the most indeterminate questions, such as what is beauty? The web solves the puzzles for us before we've had a chance to flex our cognitive muscles. As a result, we can allow them to waste away. We've seen how storytellers artfully withhold information, priming the pump of curiosity by planting questions in the reader's or viewer's mind. When someone tells you how your favorite TV series is going to end, you get angry because the pleasurable frustration of not knowing has been taken away from you. The same applies to our intellectual journeys. Answers, when they are too easily available, kill curiosity before it has a chance to take root. Since Greenman wrote his piece, Google has become ever more efficient. Its searches now often provide the answer to your query on the Google results page, so you don't even have to venture into another website. A Google murder mystery would tell you the name of the murderer on page 1. Actually, before page 1. Google is one big spoiler. J.J. Abrams, the film and television producer who created Lost and reinvigorated the Star Trek franchise, expressed his concerns about what he calls the age of immediacy in an article for Wired. Mystery, obviously, is everywhere. Is there a God? Mystery. What about life after death? Mystery. Excuse me, what material is the ShamWow made of? Mystery. Stonehenge? Bigfoot? Loch Ness? Mystery, mystery, mystery. And yet, for all that mystery, why does it feel like the world has been ripped open, all parts exposed? Why does so much seem absolutely and thoroughly demystified? These days we can leap, all of us, from a casual curiosity about anything to a sense of satisfying understanding. Instantly. Want to fold origami? There are more than 200,000 Google results on that subject available to you now. Need to know the capital of Mauritania? A recipe for sticky buns? How to pick a bicycle lock? You could answer all these questions in less time than it will take you to finish reading this article. But mystery, says Abrams, demands that you stop and consider, or at the very least, slow down and discover. So does difficulty, the world's resistance to our desires. Technology makes it easier for us to build shelters, travel, hunt, grow and prepare food, extract energy from the ground and the air, communicate across distances, and wash the dishes. The very reason we have technology is to make things easier. But making things easier can come at a cost. There can be hidden value in difficulty. It's a principle that seems to apply with special force to the way we learn. The harder things are to grasp or memorize, the more our brains rise to the challenge. Abraham Lincoln was an autodidact who made himself erudite in literature, history, and the law. He wasn't the quickest learner, however. If you had been at school with him, you probably wouldn't have marked him out as a future lawyer, let alone a future president. A cousin remembers him as somewhat dull. Not a brilliant boy, but worked his way by toil. Lincoln himself remarked that, "I am slow to learn and slow to forget that which I have learned. My mind is like a piece of steel, very hard to scratch anything on it, but almost impossible after you get it there to rub it out." Lincoln's phrase, "slow to learn and slow to forget," actually describes a universal truth about the way our brains absorb information. In the early 1990s, a cognitive scientist at the University of California named Robert Burke landed upon an insight that changed the way psychologists think about learning. In its simplest form, it is this: we learn better when we find learning difficult. We tend to assume that learning things easily is the same as learning them well. Teachers are pleased when children grasp a concept or a skill in one lesson, and so, of course, are children. The trouble is, when learning is too easy, we may not actually be learning much at all. In a series of carefully designed experiments, Bjork showed that when people learn something rapidly, they often learn it superficially. That is, they are more liable to forget it in the long term. They are also less likely to integrate the new information with what they already know, which means the new knowledge is less transferable, that is, applicable to other problems. In one experiment, students were asked to study a passage of text with the aim of remembering it. Before reading it, one group was given an outline that summarized the information in the same order as the text, while another group was given an outline that put the same information in a different order. Participants in the first group appeared to learn the text better. They scored higher on a test of recall. But when the two groups were set creative problem-solving tasks related to the text, the kind of task that required a deeper understanding of its content, it was the second group who came out on top. The extra difficulty faced by the second group in comprehending the text made it more difficult to recall, but increased their understanding of what it was about. That meant they were better equipped to transfer their knowledge to the creative problems. Psychologists at Princeton and Indiana University found that students remembered reading material better when it was printed in an ugly, difficult-to-read font. Scientists from the University of Amsterdam gave people anagram puzzles to solve, while, as an obstacle to concentration, a series of random numbers were read out. Compared with those in a control group who performed the same task without this distraction, these subjects displayed greater cognitive agility. They were more likely to take leaps of association and make unusual connections. The researchers also found that when people are forced to cope with unexpected obstacles, they react by increasing their perceptual scope, taking a mental step back to see the bigger picture. When you find your journey to work blocked by a construction site, you have to map the city in your mind. Robert Burke coined the phrase desirable difficulties to describe the counterintuitive notion that we learn better when the learning is hard. His work has influenced thinking on education. He recommends, for instance, spacing teaching sessions further apart so that students have to make more effort to recall what they learned last time. Difficulty is desirable when it comes to human information processing because it forces our brain to work harder at encoding and integrating the inputs that it has coming in. It makes us think, and the harder we think, the better we remember. The same applies to anything we can get better at. Skills come from struggle. Reading books or talking to experts may be harder, take more time, and be more frustrating than Google searches. But that's exactly why we learn more and learn deeper by doing so. Wikipedia is an amazingly powerful tool for learning, used in the right way. If you are investigating, say, medieval cathedral architecture or the invention of the scanner, and you use Wikipedia to get an overview of the subject, or as a gateway to other source materials, you are exercising your epistemic curiosity. But if you depend on Wikipedia as a source of easy answers, you will be degrading your capacity to learn. You may also come to find that you lose interest in questions that can't be easily answered. To search used to mean embarking on an arduous quest. It implied a question that led to more questions. You would encounter obstacles, or get lost, and you might not even find what you were started out looking for, but you would learn something along the way. Your perceptual scope, your mental map, would have increased. Now, a search means typing a word or two into a box, or muttering them into a mouthpiece, and getting an answer almost instantaneously. Google wants to delete that almost. In an interview given in 2004, Google's founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, described their ambition. Search will be included in people's brains, said Page. When you think about something and you don't really know much about it, you will automatically get information. All information gaps will be closed. Ultimately, said Brin, I view Google as a way to augment your brain with knowledge of the world. Page summed up their vision. You'll have the implant, where if you think about a fact, it will just tell you the answer. Google aims to save you from the itch of curiosity altogether. In a 2012 interview with The Guardian, Google's head of search, Amit Singhal, explained Google's goal in terms similar to Page and Brin. We are maniacally focusing on the user to reduce every possible friction point between them, their thoughts, and the information they want to find. Singhal's devotion to this mission is good for Google, but not necessarily good for human curiosity, which depends on friction, on the struggle to close information gaps, on uncertainty, mystery, and the awareness of ignorance. We're becoming so used to easy answers that we're forgetting how to ask questions. The Guardian asked Singhal if his efforts to refine Google's accuracy are being boosted as users learn how to enter search terms with greater precision. Actually, Singhal replied with a weary sigh, it works the other way. The more accurate the machine gets, the lazier the questions become.